Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 guaranteed exciting minutes. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. And this is the point in the programme which I generally have some aphorism or adage about the very poor quality of British democracy. Well, I have something a little bit different tonight. You know, we learned, for example, that this week that the PM has been funneling public funds to his latest squeeze at that time. But apparently this is not newsworthy to the BBC, which is extraordinary. And I want to touch upon this. There's a deep-seated rottenness in all of this that's been going on, where money is transferred to friends, associates of the ruling party. It seems to be that this strikes the very nature, the very roots of democracy. Because democracy in the end, as every governing system is, depends upon trust. And if you lose public trust, you've pretty much lost everything. And it's bad for democracy, I would suggest to you. And I'll be saying much more about this in my column in the Sunday National. You might want to look out for it, because there is research that suggests that this deep-seated rottenness is actually rotting the very foundations of the Union itself. Welcome. Thanks for joining us this evening. We have yet another great guest, as I promise you every single week, and I'm really excited that he's able to join us tonight. Tonight, the TNT show welcomes Dr. Alan Kennedy, and we will be talking about Scottish history and what lessons it provides for the present day, for example. And as I said in my promo, if any of you managed to catch it, a wise man once said, if you don't learn from history, you're condemned to relive it. And so we're going to try and avoid reliving the bits that we don't have to relive tonight with Alan's guidance. Look out for this, it's going to be exciting. And we're taking your questions live. The contact details are on the foot of the screen. The What's On guide is a place to send your queries, comments, and your questions, and we'll try and answer as many as we possibly can. So tonight, the nation talks to Dr. Alan Kennedy. Alan, how are you coping with the pandemic?
As well as can be expected, I think. I'm getting very sick of the sight of my four walls, as I suspect all of us are. But no, I mean, as well as anybody can hope, we trundle along and get through what we can, and get over what we must, I think.
Yeah. And you lecture at Dundee University. Mm-hmm. How do you cope with all of that? I mean, you do it all online? Is it all Zoomed?
It is all online. It's not Zoom. We're not allowed to use Zoom, but it's all online. Yes, we have been more or less banned from visiting the campus, certainly this year, and there were restrictions the second half of last year as well. So all of our teaching has moved online. Certainly this semester, since the start of the year, it's been literally all of it, most of it last year, which means you have to develop new skills. You have to become a broadcaster in some ways, because rather than giving a lecture, you have to record a little podcast, which has to be engaging and has to be loaded up using the appropriate software. So yes, we've had to learn an entirely new set of skills to take all of our teaching online, and the same goes for our research as well. It's very difficult to consult archives when the archives are closed and you can't get to the materials. So a challenging year for people in my profession, I think, is a fair assessment of the situation.
So tell us a bit about yourself, Alan. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, well, I was born and grew up in Inverness. So that was a few years ago now. We don't want to reveal my age, but yeah, I spent the first nearly 20 years of my life in Inverness. Extremely normal sort of childhood, just exactly what you'd expect until it came time to go to university, because at that time there wasn't a fully fledged university in the Highlands, which there is now, a very good one now in the Highlands, but there wasn't back then. So I had to go elsewhere for university. I ended up at the University of Stirling, where I enrolled in a history degree. I'd always known I wanted to. It's one of those things that one of my earliest memories about myself is that I've always enjoyed history. It was always something that I wanted to get involved in. So I did when I went to university, and I stayed at Stirling for 8 years to do my undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. and finished with my PhD eventually after a very long, hard slog. And after that, it was a case of trying to find a job. Now, most of your listeners probably won't be familiar with the horrendous ins and outs of the academic job market, because there are very few jobs for at all, particularly for younger scholars. So I do a lot of scrabbling around and going places. I ended up at the University of Manchester for a few years, doing a significant research project there, before I ended up where I am now, which is the University of Dundee, which is much more convenient for somebody who wants to remain in Scotland than Manchester was. So, potted history of my very ordinary and unexciting life so far.
But why history? Because you must have had your choice at one time.
It's odd. I mean, in one sense, I didn't have a choice, because I always was sort of instinctively drawn to history. There was no way I would have sort of been happy doing anything else. But as to why history, I really can't answer that question. It's if I was pushed, I think the thing that drew me towards history, and particularly Scottish history, is just the richness of the stories that it offers. There's so much interesting stuff going on in the Scottish past, and I think the excitement of those stories, the resonance, the richness of those stories just kept pulling me back. So I wish I could give a really kind of deep philosophical answer about history being so important and being, core to my identity or what have you. But ultimately, it was just because it was the most interesting thing that I had found, and it remains the most interesting thing, certainly in intellectual terms, that I've ever come across.
When did it happen? I mean, what age were you when you said, "This is it. This is for me. Nothing else will do"?
I must have been very young, because I always remember wanting to do history in some way, shape, or form. Not necessarily to become a historian. I'm not sure I was aware as a child that there was such a thing as a historian who sort of just read history all day long and wrote it. But I think I always knew that I wanted to be involved in history in some way, whether that was even just being a history teacher or working at a battlefield visitor center or something like that. But it's something that has always had an attraction to me, and I'm not entirely sure I can remember a time where it wasn't. So again, it's difficult to answer that question, because it's just always been the thing that has grabbed me, and continues to.
You said that there was a richness about Scottish history. Give us an example of how that richness, because I guess a lot of people, historians in other countries, would say the same thing. My country is full of rich stories, and that would be true. So what is it about Scottish history in particular?
Yeah, well, on one level, nothing in particular about Scottish history. As you say, all countries have their own histories, often just as rich, if not richer, than Scotland. So I wouldn't want to make any exceptionalist claim that the Scottish past is somehow more interesting or more exciting than anyone else's, because I don't think it is. But I think it's very for very personal reasons, I found it very resonant for me. I mean, as I say, I grew up in the Highlands. There are relics all over the Highlands of the past, particularly the 19th century past, the Highland Clearances. And I think if you grow up in the Highlands with even a sort of passing interest in Scottish history, you recognise that history is there, that it is that it remains important, and that people remain deeply invested in that history. And I think it's that sense of personal connection which has always made Scottish history, for me, that much more resonant, that much more interesting than other types of history. It's not because the material itself is more interesting necessarily, it's because my connection to it feels more immediate. And I think that is probably why, although I'm always interested in other types of history, it's ultimately always the history of Scotland that pulls me back in. And obviously it's what I've ended up doing as a career for those reasons.
Can we talk about one aspect of Scottish history, general history, but the Scottish connection to this particular theme? Because Kenny Lowe has submitted a question about sovereignty being vested with the people of Scotland. Now, there is a common view that sovereignty in the rest of the UK is vested in the Crown and Parliament, but that's not the case in Scotland. What's the background to that? What's the history of that?
I mean, that's really interesting, because that's a truism. Everybody trots that out. The historical background is extremely shallow. I mean, if you look at Scotland before 1707, so when Scotland was still independent, I don't think you would have found anybody who would seriously have claimed that sovereignty rested with the people of Scotland. I mean, you'll often see the people, public opinion invoked rhetorically, but there's two things about that. One, it's rhetoric. It's usually for a sort of purposes of making a point strongly. And two, they don't mean the people as in normal, ordinary Scots. They mean the elites. They mean the nobility, usually. Sometimes the representatives of the other so-called socialist states, so the clergy or the borough elites, the town elites. So what you actually see, I think, in Scotland before 1707, if people talk about sovereignty, they probably talk about it in mostly the same way as they do in England, which is Parliament is where sovereignty is vested, or the Crown in Parliament. So I'm not a historian of modern Scotland, so I wouldn't like to speculate about the more recent roots of that. But what I can say is that this idea of sovereignty being popular in Scotland, vested in the people and not in institutions and not in the Crown, I don't think anybody in Scotland before 1707 would have recognised that. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that Scots have this unique, democratic, popular understanding of sovereignty. Because as far as I can see, they didn't before 1707. Now, as I say, whether that's developed more recently, whether there are 19th or 20th century roots to this idea of popular sovereignty, that can legitimately be pointed to. I'm not so sure about that either, but there might be. But certainly any thinking about independent Scotland, it seems to me to be something of a myth, or at the very least a misreading of the rhetoric of the time.
What seems to be the case, based on what you've told us, is that the last Scottish Parliament was deemed to be sovereign, effectively, after 1707. And the whole idea of the claim of right and sovereignty to be vested with the people is perhaps more of a 20th century view, which didn't apply back then at all, really. That's interesting.
Yeah. If I could just jump in, I think that you used the term claim of right there. That's really interesting, because of course there are two claims of right. The original one is from 1689, and it does explicitly suggest that, or at least explicitly is the wrong word, certainly implies strongly that Parliament is sovereign. And I think you would struggle to find in the claim of right, except possibly for the narrow issue of how the church should be governed. But apart from that, I think you'd struggle to find any rhetoric that supports the idea that the last Scottish Parliament, or the second last Scottish Parliament, there are actually two after 1689, regarded itself, or regarded the people as sovereign rather than itself. So claim of right is an interesting one, because there are two, and we mustn't get them confused.
Okay. We've had a question from EFS Moore, and the question is, what do you think about Neil Oliver's take on the Highland Clearances?
Well, I confess I tend to avoid Neil Oliver's take, so I'm not entirely sure what his take on the Highland Clearances are, or is, I should say. What I can say more broadly is that the Highland Clearances is one of those episodes in Scottish history which has been very heavily mythologized. So a lot of people looking back on the Highland Clearances tend to see it as almost a kind of English plot to drive out Highlanders, come in and drive out the Gaels and do all sorts of unspeakable things to them. The Highland Clearances mostly are perpetrated on Highlanders by other Highlanders or other Scots. There are some examples of English landlords buying up land and being responsible for clearance, but it's not a sort of English plot or a British plot to depopulate the Highlands. It's something that's much more indigenous, also something that's linked to very wide structural issues to do with the development of the British and imperial economy, the development of the European economy as well, particularly in the while the Napoleonic War is going on. That forces a degree of economic restructuring that has knock-on effects for the Highlands. So the other side of that, of course, is that there isn't a sort of an apology or an apologia for the landlords, saying that they were absolutely doing their best. They were really sort of kind gentlemen who tried their best but ultimately couldn't stand in the way of progress. I mean, that too is over-egged. There are it is clear that as well as these big sort of structural problems, there were very clear policy issues or policy decisions made on the part of individual landlords that clearing land was in the best interests of their bottom line, essentially. So I think the Highland Clearances is a nice example of something that I think happens a lot in public understanding of Scottish history. You get these very strongly entrenched narratives, neither of which are quite right or quite match up perfectly with the evidence. So I think that's the Highland Clearances is an example of how you can. There are different myths, both of which can be debunked to some extent, and leaving us with a much kind of messier reality, which is perhaps less straightforward to engage with and to understand, but which I think it's important that we do engage with.
Good point. Good point. Charles Smith is asking, you're getting loads of questions tonight. Charles Smith is saying, this is interesting actually. Are there any ancient Scottish parliamentary or official titles that were lost after the Union that might be worth considering reusing in an independent Scotland?
Well, there is a sort of native terminology which does not survive 1707. I mean, the most important one is that the Scottish version of the term Member of Parliament was Commissioner to Parliament. So we called our MPs commissioners. That's something I would have loved to have seen that taken up when the Scottish Parliament, the current Scottish Parliament, was created. So rather than having MSPs, if we could have had commissioners, that would have been a lovely nod back. Rather confusing nod back, perhaps, to pre-1707. But that's one example of the nomenclature. There are other institutions, offices in the pre-1707 Scottish Parliament which we have lost. For example, the person presiding over Parliament was the Chancellor. The Chancellor is also the sort of formal head of the Scottish Government. Well, obviously the King's the head of the Scottish Government, but the Chief Minister, I suppose, is the Chancellor, but he doubles up as the chair of the person chairing Parliament. You have a wonderful committee called the Lords of the Articles, which I think is a great name. This is a body which is responsible for drafting legislation and for acting as a kind of steering committee for Parliament. I'd love to see that return. Well, maybe I wouldn't actually, because it has a rather poor reputation pre-1707, but it's a nice example of these titles that are lost. We also have the High Commissioner, which is the King's representative in Parliament after 1603, so after the King moves off south. So yes, there are plenty of there is a kind of native tradition of offices of terminology which doesn't survive 1707, which we would maybe like to see. Maybe would have been nice to have seen return when the Scottish Parliament returned. Seem to have lost our hosts, unfortunately. We've got you back. You're muted, I'm afraid.
Yes, sorry, we're having a few technical difficulties here.
Back now, that's the main thing.
So I wonder if you could just repeat that. I missed that, what you were saying earlier.
I was just going over some of these titles or institutions that have been lost from the pre-1707 Parliament. So I think we covered the Commissioners, Lords of the Articles, the Chancellor presiding over Parliament, and the High Commissioner, the King's representative. So there's some wonderful, rich, resonant titles which did not survive 1707 and have not returned since.
Oh, that's a pity. I love the idea of commissioners.
Yes, it's a particularly Scottish term. It's not something I don't think you see in the English parliamentary tradition, but it's got a nice ring to it, I always think.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I find the MSP title very odd. You know, it just somehow it sounds like a sort of strange halfway house. You're not quite a member of Parliament. You're a member of this other thing. So anyway, maybe that's just me.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and having the word commissioner would have solved that problem, but alas, we didn't do it.
Yeah. Hashbury Stumble is asking if you agree that there's not enough taught about the decline of the British Empire, but it strikes me that your specialisation is prior to the emergence of the British Empire.
Yes, you're right. Although this kind of question obviously has become a really important one for historians of all stripes in the last few years. I think traditionally, no. I think that would be a reasonable point. There has not been enough focus on not just the decline of the British Empire, but the dark side of the British Empire. I mean, the British Empire is a deeply problematic institution for lots and lots of reasons, and I think there was traditionally a tendency to perhaps airbrush that out, to try to think of the empire as something we should all be proud of. I do think that this has begun to change more recently. There is a lot more focus in schools, particularly Scottish schools, where Curriculum for Excellence gives a little bit of flexibility here for pupils to explore these kind of more difficult questions about the imperial legacy, particularly, of course, related to slavery and the slave trade. And that's feeding through into universities as well, where these kind of questions have been much more prominent over the last generation or so than they had been before. So I think I would agree that there has conventionally been not enough focus on this. It's still a difficult topic to discuss sometimes, and provokes strong reactions from people who do still feel some degree of pride in Britain's imperial history. But it's important that we are aware of these very problematic aspects of empire, and I think it is good that we have seen, particularly in the last couple of years, this very strong push towards openly discussing these issues, because they're important issues, and they need to be talked about.
I mean, I wouldn't wish to defend the British Empire or any other empire, but I would say that it's probably a characteristic, wouldn't you agree, of all empires, that they have to behave in a particular way. I mean, you can't run an empire by being generous, kind, and supportive. The whole point of an empire is to be exploitative, surely. So it's hard to say you can do that in a sort of terribly generous way.
No, you're right. Imperialism is an inherently exploitative endeavor. You can't be, or at least I don't think you can be a sort of kind imperialist or a nice imperialist. It's inherently an exploitative, a cruel way to interact with the rest of the world. I mean, I think what makes the British Empire a little bit more difficult than others is partly its sheer size, because it is bigger than any other empire, but also the very strong sort of issues of race that underpin it, because at every stage in its development, the British Empire is rooted in ideas about white superiority and the inferiority of people of African descent, people of Asian descent. That's how do you justify taking somebody's land away from them? You do it by characterizing them as somehow inferior to you. So that's core, it seems to me, of the British imperial project. It's core to all imperial projects, but it's particularly, because of that racial element, it's particularly strong and particularly problematic, I think, in the British iteration of that. Again, which is why this is such a problematic issue.
Yeah, and it does seem to me it's almost independent of the size of the imperial power. I mean, you know, one thinks of Belgium and the way the abominable way they behaved in the Congo. I mean, that's a small country exploiting a huge country. Anyway, it's one of these things. Andrew Barr is asking, is it possible to estimate when Scotland was founded?
Ooh. Getting uncomfortably outside my comfort zone here. There are colleagues at particularly University of St Andrews I would direct you towards for a better answer. The short answer is no. There isn't a date in which you can say Scotland appears. What I think we see instead is a very kind of gradual process of various groupings, various kingdoms and sub-kingdoms sort of coming together in a messy sort of way. I mean, most of us will be familiar probably with the traditional king lists where you get Kenneth MacAlpin as Kenneth the First, comes to the throne, I think it's 843 is when he's supposed to become the first king of Scots. And you have this neat line of kings all the way through to the current queen. That obviously is misleading. So my understanding of the situation is we're probably looking at something around about the 11th century before you can realistically talk about something that looks vaguely like Scotland. But even then, you've got a lot of development still to go until you get, if nothing else, the landmass of Scotland complete. I mean, it's not until Scotland gets its hands on the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland in the 1460s and 70s, that we have most of what looks like the current landmass of Scotland under the control of the Scottish Crown. So it's a very long, drawn-out, messy process, and I don't think there's any point at which we can say, yep, Scotland did not exist the year before that, and it did exist that year. It's nothing as neat as that, unfortunately. It'd be lovely if it was. It would make our lives a lot easier, but I don't think that's the case.
Well, it would perhaps be atypical, because I don't think you can, I suspect you can't point to any particular state or nation and say it was definitely started then as opposed to.
Yeah, that's a fair point, unless you're talking about sort of very recent or artificial state creations. But when you're talking about old national communities like Scotland or England or Ireland or what have you, we are talking about lost in the mists of time territory, and there's no getting away from that, I fear.
We talked about sovereignty and the view about where sovereignty is vested and how that seems to have changed over the years. Is there anything else that you have come across that where the sort of common view doesn't quite square with the actuality?
We're getting into the territory of historical myths here, aren't we? Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of truisms about Scottish history which don't quite hold up under scrutiny. I mean, in my period, the one that I probably am most familiar with is sort of popular understandings of the process of union. So that at the end of the 17th and 18th centuries, which I think tends to be seen as either a sort of inexorable process of economic reality forcing the Scots into union, or it's seen as some kind of mendacious English plot to kind of capture Scotland. As with most of these myths, there's elements of truth in both of those. But what we actually have in the process of union is a much kind of messier process that's got longer roots in Scotland than we might think. So, I mean, the idea of union with England as a proposition has roots in Scottish thinking going at least to the early 16th century. The famous humanist scholar John Mayer is an advocate of union in the early 1500s. And similarly, as we go through the late 16th century into throughout the whole of the 17th century, there are always people talking about union and why it would be good for Scotland. Scots talking about this. So there's a long kind of intellectual tradition there. There's lots of discussion about the economic imperatives for union, the diplomatic and geopolitical advantages of it, that underpin the kind of crisis moment that we get to at the early 18th century, which leads to the Treaty of 1706-7. So that's a nice example, I think, of how we tend to have a rather simplistic view, perhaps, of the union process that doesn't square up with the messiness of the reality. You could say the same things about the Wars of Independence in the medieval period. I think most of us tend to think of this as, nasty Edward I comes up, and then up pop Wallace and Bruce and knock him back again, and everything is great. In actual fact, the Wars of Independence are a much more long, drawn-out process, which outlives both Wallace and Bruce by a very, very long way, and it's a process which is underpinned by effectively civil war among the Scots as well. There are Scots who support independence, or what passes for independence in the medieval period. There are Scots who support the claims of Edward I, II, and III. There are Scots who support alternative candidates for the throne, particularly the Balliol family, John Balliol and Edward Balliol. We seem to have lost our host again, unfortunately. The technical difficulties coming back to bite us. But again, the Wars of Independence then are something where the kind of neat narrative that a lot of us maybe are familiar with is not, it does not necessarily match up with the reality. Hello, you're back. You're back again. We lost you for a second time. You're on mute again, I'm afraid.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah. It's all right, no problem. IT problems can't be helped, I fear. So I was just talking there about how the Wars of Independence is another example of how contemporary ideas about Scottish history sometimes don't match up with the reality. You can say that about other periods. Mary Queen of Scots, we all have views about her, and her reign is much more complex than we might think. The Jacobites too, and we talked about the Highland Clearances as well. So there's lots of these examples of the kind of stories we tell ourselves today about Scottish history, perhaps not quite matching up with the complexity and the lack of clarity of the past. Because obviously the past is just like the present; it's a mess. There's no clear narrative. There's no nice linear progression of events. It's chaos mostly. Most of us, as we make our way through current affairs, are groping in the dark and making a mess of things. And our ancestors were no different, I fear.
But perhaps that's why we have historians, isn't
it? Exactly. Thank you.
To help us navigate all this stuff.
Yeah, precisely. And that's actually a really interesting point, because there's an ongoing debate, and there has been for as long as history as a profession has existed, about what do historians do? And one of the kind of the core things is, are we responsible for imposing order on the past where it doesn't exist? Because if I decide to write a book, say, on the Union, well, the rationale for writing a book on the Union is I want to write the book on the Union, but there is obviously other stuff going on around 1707, which is just as important to people living at the time. So yeah, there is I don't want to get into issues about like postmodernism and all that, but there is an interesting question there about what do historians do, and are we guilty of kind of giving the past a sense of cohesion that it doesn't actually have and shouldn't really be looked for. But anyway.
Here's an interesting question, and it probably stems from the same rationale, trying to make order out of what's available. Claire is asking, do you think that Mary Queen of Scots could have escaped execution if she had gone to France in 1568 instead of seeking refuge in the Tudor court?
Ooh, that's an interesting. Again, there are other people I would who would be better position to answer that. I mean, I suppose the problem is that France, at the time Mary's reign comes to an end and when she's fleeing to England, France is descending into chaos of its own in its wars of religion, which are extremely brutal and bloody. And it's hard to see how an ex-Queen of Scots, a Queen Dowager of France, sort of turning up on the shore of France would have been particularly welcome. Whether they would have executed her is unlikely. I mean, the rationale that Elizabeth I ultimately has for executing Mary of treason probably wouldn't, I suspect, have arisen in a French context. But there's all sorts of interesting questions there about, would you have seen a re-emergence of the kind of Anglo-French war by proxy in Scotland that was happening in the 1540s? I mean, England and France are essentially at war in Scotland in the 1540s at the start of Mary's reign while she's still a child. I mean, would that have reappeared in the 1560s? I don't know. Very different context, with Scotland having gone through its Reformation. I mean, I think ultimately, though, the only way that Mary comes out of the end of her reign any better than she actually did is if she regains the throne. And once she'd fled Scotland, it's very difficult to see how she could have regained the throne at all. Oh dear, we lost our host again. I can indeed, yes.
Yes, I've done that. Sorry about that again. I've got, but let's soldier on if we can.
Absolutely, we'll try.
Yeah, we had another question, by the way, which I think you might want to take a crack at. It's about the Alien Act. Jim McIntyre, his question is, do you think the Alien Act of 1704 and 1705 wasn't an aggressive act on part of Westminster?
I think it was, and I think it was designed to be. I mean, the Alien Act, for those who don't know, is essentially a threat on the part of the English Parliament that unless the Scots enter union negotiations by a set date, any Scots living in England will be designated aliens and therefore will not be able to trade, will lose rights that they might have had. And that is a really big problem because there are lots of Scots operating in England, living in England, trading from England, big businesses in London, trading with the colonies or what have you. That's a really big problem. It's designed to be a sort of something to force the Scots to come to the negotiating table over union. I think, though, we have to be careful here because there's a tendency to look at the Alien Act and say, oh, well, that's evidence that Scotland is forced into union and it's all perfidious Albion, forcing this on the Scots. We have to remember is that the Alien Act is a response, a direct response to a piece of legislation passed by the Scots earlier on in the Scottish Parliament, the so-called Act of Security, which is in which the Scots say basically we are not going to allow Queen Anne's successor to be the same person as succeeds to the throne of England. The English had just designated Sophia of Hanover, the mother of George I, as he later becomes, as Queen Anne's heir. The Scots, through the Act of Security, say, well, we're not going to accept her unless various conditions are met. The point about that is that's an extraordinarily provocative act on the part of the Scots because of the wider context. England and Scotland are both involved in the War of the Spanish Succession at this point. Really big conflict that becomes a kind of existential conflict for many European states, including Queen Anne's realms. So the Scots threatening this, the not to accept Sophia as successor is a really big security concern for England. The Scots know it is, and that's why they do it, because their hope is that they can get an improved union out of this. Of course, they overplay their hand. The Alien Act turns out to be enough, I think, to wake most Scots, but a lot of Scots up to the fact that actually they are negotiating with a stronger partner here, and at a point of security crisis, that means that the Scots pretty much have to get on the same page as the English government. So yes, going back to the question, the Alien Act is designed to be, perhaps hostile is not the right word, but certainly it's playing hardball. But A, there are reasons for that, and B, the Scots had been playing hardball as well. So it's not as poor innocent Scotland being beaten over the head by a nasty English bully. It's not that sort of situation, I think.
Got it. Yeah. And you mentioned that there had been various attempts at union prior to 1707. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, as I mentioned, Scots had been talking about union as an abstract thing for well over a century, 2 centuries even, since, if not more than that, by the time it comes about. But ever since James VI became King of England in 1603, succeeding Elizabeth I and becoming the first, what he calls himself, the King of Great Britain, and obviously legally still King of England and King of Scotland. Great Britain doesn't exist yet, except in James's imagination, but nonetheless. But ever since that point, there had been various sort of programs for tying England and Scotland closer together. I mean, James himself, his first order of business after rocking up in London is to push this idea of what he calls a more perfect union. So he wants to try and merge England and Scotland into one state. I think the metaphor he uses at one point is he wants to conceptualize England and Scotland as 2 streams which flow together to form a new river, so they completely intermingle into a new British kingdom. what he's talking about there is an incorporating union, and that's what sort of happens in 1707. Not quite as perfectly as James would have wanted, but that's one sort of program that emerges very early on. But as we go through the 17th century, we get other sort of attempts or ideas about union that emerge. I mean, the most obvious one after James's program is the Covenanters in the late 1630s and into the 1640s, for whom who want closer union between England and Scotland. They see this as crucial to the security of Scotland, but also the security of their revolution. Covenanters pushed through a really substantial revolution at the end of the 1630s. What they talk about, though, is confederal union. And this is a bit vague, but it essentially means England and Scotland cooperating in some way as equals. So rather than merging into one state, they could very well stay completely distinct, but there'll be some way of coordination, cooperation on equal footing. I mean, the problem with that is, you can probably guess the problem. What's the attraction for England? I mean, England is much bigger, much richer, much more powerful than Scotland. Why would they want to have this equal relationship? So as soon as the English Civil War comes to an end and England is a bit more stable, this notion of confederal union falls very much out of favour, although Scottish Covenanters often continue to push it as an ideal solution. After that, we get obviously the Cromwellian conquest at the start of the 1650s, introduces a new model of union, which is essentially Scottish absorption into England at the point of a sword. Problem with that is, A, the Scots don't like it for obvious reasons, and B, it's extremely expensive from England's point of view. You only hold a conquered nation using military muscle, and that's expensive. So a sort of coercive absorption union based on absorption is also problematic. Later than that, even into the 1660s and 1670s, we get the emergence of programs for commercial union under Charles II. There are actually negotiations right at the end of the 1660s to try and work out a commercial union between England and Scotland, where they will remain politically separate, but will have some form of kind of free trading arrangement almost across the British Isles. That again comes to nothing because nobody's particularly keen. It's neither the Scots nor English commissioners who are appointed particularly like the idea. What that means then, in a period of only about 70 years, we've had at least 4 different models of union that have emerged, that have been discussed, that might have been actually tried out at various points before we even get to the process of actually creating the Treaty of Union that emerges in Queen Anne's reign. And I think that underlines the fact that union is not, from the Scots' point of view, union is not an event that comes out of the blue at the start of the 18th century. It's something that had been absolutely central to Scottish politics, to Scottish ideas about self-identity, to Scottish political philosophy, to economic philosophy even, for decades, if not centuries. And I think that's something we often forget. We tend to think of the Union as something that happens at a particular point in Queen Anne's reign. Actually, it's much longer term and much more longer gestating than that.
It's interesting you say all of that, because I detect, particularly amongst those who don't favour separation, that they seem to be coming around to a view that a non-incorporated union would be ideal. Now, how that would work would be fascinating, because you just explained why. Nobody back then believed it would work. So it's difficult to see how it would actually work now.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I'm obviously not qualified to talk on current constitutional issues, but what I can say is that people in the 17th century recognised that that any form of union has problems and is going to be complicated, particularly when you're dealing, as you are now and as you were in the 17th century, with one much more powerful partner, much bigger and richer partner, and one much smaller and much weaker one. How you come up with institutions, structures that please both those parties is, I think, a really difficult question. I mean, the way it works and the way they get around that in 1707 essentially is an incorporating union that actually leaves a lot of Scottish civic identity in place, and and then a sort of almost a century of more or less benign neglect on the part of the UK government after 1707. There's not much interest in sort of getting involved in Scottish affairs. So you end up with this weird situation where you have an incorporating union in the 18th century, but also a sort of de facto form of home rule, which works because most people in England don't really care very much. I think I'm not sure I detect that same level of not caring in current politics. So I'm not sure that that model would necessarily translate very well to the 21st century. But it's just interesting to reflect that.
No, the polls would suggest otherwise. And that if people south of the border are positive with the choice, do you want to leave the EU, and if that resulted in Scotland leaving, how would you feel? And they said, let's leave the EU. It seems to be fairly clear cut. A number of people are asking, what's your own take on independence? Are you in favour or against it?
I can speak about this personally, not professionally. I'm a historian, not a political scientist. I mean, I do support Scottish independence. I have done for quite some time, largely on the grounds that I think Scotland constitutes a sort of natural unit, and it makes sense to me that that the government of Scotland should be at the level of Scotland, rather than I think the UK level doesn't really make sense. I think it's sort of Scottish independence feels much more natural, much more sensible. But again, that is a sort of personal political opinion. That's not rooted in a sort of deep reading of the history, because I don't think, and this is a mistake I think is often made. I don't think you can extrapolate contemporary solutions directly from reflecting on history. I think what you can do is you can discuss, well, how did we get to this point? What are the issues that have led us to the situation we are now? But the past is not a guide to the future. The past contextualizes the present, but it doesn't give you a roadmap to the future. So when I say that I am in favour of independence and I would vote yes in another referendum, as I voted yes in the previous one, that is not necessarily, well, it might be subconsciously based on my historical work, but it's certainly not consciously built on a sort of a coherent theory that, you know, the entirety of Scottish history means that we must be independent. It's nothing as functional as that. But oddly, I'm intrigued that most of the listeners asking that question clearly couldn't tell from my previous answers which way I would have voted. I suppose I'll take that as a good thing. I didn't give myself away.
Well, I think you have to take it as a positive, because you're paid to be objective, and
as much as possible, anyway.
Itself. So now that we've sort of segued away a little bit from Scottish history, then looking at the present situation, and you've told us your views. What's your take on the run-up to the May 6th election? Because the SNP, which is the main independence party, seems to be all over the lot. There's salmon, there's sturgeon, there's a whole bunch of alba. I mean, what's your take on all of that?
Well, partly my take is, and I kind of wish as I was a historian living 200 years from now and working on this period, because I think there's so much interesting stuff going on that if you were a historian working on early 21st century Scotland, it would be absolutely fascinating. And I think you're right, the kind of the current psychodrama that we seem to have over the direction of the independence movement is really, really interesting. So that's, if you like, the kind of sober academic answer. That it's fascinating and it'd be worth studying. I mean, my own personal view is that it's slightly embarrassing, perhaps, that we seem to have got ourselves into this messy situation where the tenor of the debate is very bitter. There seems to be a lot of sort of shallow personality stuff driving a lot of our politics at the moment, which I think is perhaps not terribly attractive. And it does mean that this election feels odd. The kind of, or to me it does anyway, that the kind of questions we're having to ask ourselves and the kind of events we're seeing play out are very strange. It's vaguely Shakespearean in some ways. So yeah, it's weird, and it's fascinating at the same time.
I mean, some people might argue it's a positive development, in the sense that for a lot of people, elections are just plain boring because they're not interested in politics. They don't pay any regard to the news. Politics comes on the news, they switch off, and they probably adhere to the general, slightly sort of interesting view that politics is show business for ugly people. It's that sort of that sort of distance from it. And this enlivens that. But for folks like that, this is great because it gives them something to chew on that they can connect to, personalities.
Yeah.
Oh, we've all got that. We've all got that. And this allows me to connect to this stuff that I regarded as somewhat ethereal and over there somewhere. Now it's immediate. I can connect to that.
Yeah, I suppose if you like politics as soap opera, then this election is great for that. I mean, I think my response would be that I don't think anybody could seriously claim that Scottish politics has been boring for the last few years, even before this election. I think we've basically, if you found Scottish politics in the 2010s boring, then you're always going to find politics boring no matter what happens, because there's already been so much happening. I think the other problem is that, or for me, and again, this is an entirely personal view, I think we have to reflect on whether the kinds of personalities that we are seeing becoming prominent in this election are the sorts of personalities we want to be prominent. There seems to me a lot of quite ugly emotion and other unpleasant things knocking around and driving some of our politics at the moment. And I'm not sure that the entertainment value of that is sort of sufficient compensation for the rather sort of retrograde feel of a lot of this psychodrama. So that would be my, again, entirely personal and unscientific take on this.
No, I think that's a reasonable point. I think, though, perhaps some of this is driven by the dumbing down that's taken place, not just in politics, but across the whole spectrum of public life. Because it's, and to some extent, I think the media have to shoulder some responsibility for this. If it bleeds, it leads. It has to be a soundbite that encourages, in response, political parties and individuals to use sound bites, because they know that's what's going to get. They know they're only going to get 30 seconds. So what they do is they try and reduce that 30-second, that major political perspective into 30 seconds, or maybe a minute or two, because they know the broadcaster's not going to use any more than that. And maybe they're badly served by the media in that regard. I want to take you back, if I may, because we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Kenny Lowe is asking, this is a really good question. If you could rewrite one chapter of history, what would it be?
Oh, goodness me. Well, I mean, there's lots of unpleasant stuff that happened in Scottish history. I think one thing that's worth that I think a lot of us would like to see rewritten, and it's something that there is a campaign about at the moment, is the history of witch hunting in Scotland. Scotland, as I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is unusually keen on witch hunting. We have a rather more intense and extensive witch hunt in Scotland than in most other countries, certainly more so than England. I mean, I think England executes about 500 people for witchcraft overall. We execute something like 2,500. So, that's in absolute terms. If you think about proportionally in terms of population, the Scottish witch hunt is one of the most intense in Europe. So I think one thing that would be nice to see excised from Scottish history is that, because that is something that leads to the traumatic deaths of many thousands of innocent people, predominantly women, of course, for whom witch hunting is a very powerful tool of oppression and of marginalisation. So I think it'd be nice to see that got out of the way. Similarly, and I'm going to abuse my position here and give you a second thing I'd like to see excised. I think Scotland's involvement in slavery and the slave trade would be something we'd very much like to see removed from our national story, because again, this is something that the Scots are very deeply involved in, that in some ways underpins the rejuvenation of Scotland in the 18th century, and it's something that we can not look back on proudly, I think. So again, it'd be nice to see these forms of exploitation and subjugation of marginalised groups. It'd be nice if we could see them removed from Scotland's story. But then again, if we did that, it wouldn't be Scotland's story anymore. So perhaps not.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably true to say as well that every nation or every state has dark periods in its background that it would wish it weren't there. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that almost all the European states and many African states too were involved in slavery. So, you know,
they were, but I think there's a tendency. I was just going to say that there's a tendency to say, well, because of that, therefore Britain was just as bad as everyone else. Actually, I think there's a very strong argument that Britain was worse in terms of the sheer extent to which we exploited the slave system. I think there is a strong argument that Britain is a world leader in this particular form of vice, and Scotland does not just come along for the ride. Scotland is very actively involved throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries.
Yeah. Here's a question from Thomas MacArthur. He's asking, do you think that Scottish politics taught at school it covers what you would like to see covered?
Scottish politics or Scottish history? Yeah,
Scottish history and politics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, everybody who specialises in a certain area wants to see more of it taught at schools. I mean, my main concern, I think, is that what I want to see pupils developing is the ability to engage critically with sources, with material that they read, with material that they watch. So I'm not so interested in saying that we must teach people X, Y, and Z about Scotland's national story. If they want to find out about that, they can. What I am much more interested in doing is giving people the kind of critical capacity to, you know, if they're scrolling on Facebook, they need to be able to, it'd be nice if they could spot fake news and sort of critically engage with it and think, is this actually plausible? Is this persuasive as a piece of writing? So I'm not sure I would want to prescribe particular topics or information to be delivered. I mean, we live in an age when information is very easily accessible. It's more the critical skills that I want to see us developing in schools and indeed at universities and colleges too. And so if we can do that by using Scottish history, fantastic. But if it's done using other types of history, other national stories, again, fantastic. So long as we develop the skills, that's what matters to me.
Good point, Alan. If people watching and listening tonight want to know more about what you're doing, how can they do that? Do you have a website? Can people get in touch and tap into this knowledge?
Well, there's two ways. First of all, you can find me on the University of Dundee's web pages. If all else fails, just put my name into Google and I should pop up on my staff page should pop up, which will tell you about my teaching and research. The other thing to bear in mind is that I work with a magazine called History Scotland. I'm consultant editor of that magazine, which comes out every second month, bringing kind of up-to-date historical research for a general public. So if you wanted to subscribe to that magazine, you could see what I'm up to. But equally, they have a website, historyscotland.com, where you'll see a lot of information resources about Scottish history, including bits and pieces that I've contributed to them. So that's the two most obvious ways of finding out more about me, is through my institutional webpage, which will link also to various projects that I'm involved in and research centres, but also through History Scotland, which is my second sort of professional hat that I wear, as well as Dundee. So if anybody is wanting to learn more, that's how they do it.
There you are, folks. There's the place to go. You've got all the details. A big thank you, Alan, for being our guest tonight. I've certainly learned a lot, and I suspect those watching and listening have done so too. So a big thank you to you, and a big thank you to everyone watching tonight. And I want to apologise for all the technical problems we've had. These things happen even in the best ordered organisations. I need to say to you though, that do look out for the column in the Sunday National this weekend, because I think you're going to enjoy it. There's going to be some fascinating facts there that you may not have come across elsewhere. By the way, next week's guest is Jim Fairley, who's standing for Kinrossshire and South Perthshire in the Scottish Parliamentary elections that are coming up on May the 6th. And so we'll hear from Jim next week, and I'm very much looking forward to that. If you want to know what's happening on Indie Live, who's coming up on the TNT show in the weeks and months to come, you'll see it on the What's On guide. You go there, you'll see all the details. Thank you for your support. A big thank you to Alan. A big thank you to the folks behind the scenes. All the problems that we had technically are down to me, not to them or to Alan. Thank you again. And please join us next Wednesday at the same time when our guest will be Jim Fairley. Take care. Good night. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. Good night, everyone. Take care. Stay safe.